Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Marisa LaFleur, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with Catherine Grace Katz, presenting her book, The Daughters of Yalta, The Churchills, Roosevelts, and Harrimans, A Story of Love and War, joined in conversation by Jeffrey Toobin. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these unprecedented times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and also browse our bookshelves right from your home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. So if you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button right at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase The Daughters of Yalta at harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this author series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you so much for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last several months, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, but we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Catherine Grace Katz is a writer and historian from Chicago. She holds degrees in history from Harvard and Cambridge and is currently pursuing her JD at Harvard Law School. The Daughters of Yalta is her first book. It tells the story of three young women, Kathleen Harriman, daughter of the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Sarah Churchill, and Anna Roosevelt, who were chosen by their fathers to travel with them to the Yalta Conference in February 1945. The New York Times calls it an entertaining history packed with vivid personalities, jockeying aides, and insider observations about a pivotal moment in history. And the Wall Street Journal writes that The Daughters of Yalta is skillfully written and meticulously researched. It's an extraordinary work that reveals the human side underlying the politics, and goes on to describe it as a thoroughly engrossing book, as acute about the contentious politics of the day as it is about the remarkable daughters who participated. Catherine is joined in conversation tonight by Jeffrey Toobin, Chief Legal Analyst at CNN, staff writer at The New Yorker, and best-selling author. We're so pleased to have them both here with us tonight to discuss The Daughters of Yalta. Without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Catherine and Jeffrey.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you to Harvard Bookstore for being just an absolutely great bookstore that has been a part of my life for decades, and something that you know is. I mean, we love all independent bookstores, but Harvard Bookstore is a classic of the genre, and I am delighted to talk to my friend Catherine Katz about her terrific book, The Daughters of Yalta. And hi, Catherine.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me to the Harvard Bookstore. I really appreciate it. And it's a great, for me, it's such a personal experience too, having spent a lot of time in Harvard Square. And I was at Harvard as an undergrad, and my senior year, our dorm was under construction. And so my dorm room was actually the apartment above Harvard Bookstore, literally right above the store. And so I was up there writing my senior thesis thinking someday I hope that I can write a book and maybe I'll be lucky enough to be able to give a talk with the Harvard Bookstore and share my story with people like me who loved visiting there and exploring the wonderful titles that Harvard Bookstore has. And so this is just so exciting, and thank you so much, Jeffrey, for speaking with me this evening.
Well, it didn't take you long to write that book, and but okay, but let's talk about, you said you had, like, you grew up in Chicago. Like, yeah. What did you want to be when you grew up?
So I think a large part of me always knew that I wanted to be, and hopefully, one day would be someone who was a writer and historian. My favorite books as a child were things like Little House on the Prairie and Anne of Green Gables and The Little Princess. And these were stories about young women who wanted to be writers and grew up to become writers. But I also always had a strong interest in World War II, I think largely because I was introduced to movies like The Sound of Music and The Great Escape and White Christmas at a very early age. Those were family favorites. And my grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, and I used to chase him around at Thanksgiving with a yellow legal pad, asking him questions about his experience during the war and trying to record these memories for my family. And so as the self-appointed historian, I think that history was something that I knew would always be part of my life at a very early age.
What did your grandfather do in the war?
So he was in the Navy. He actually went to Harvard Business School and received his officer's commission in a 15-month program when the war broke out. And he then used that business education and his experience as an officer in the Navy to be one of the officers in charge of a munitions depot in New Jersey, which sent the ammo to for D-Day. So it was great to hear about his experiences during the war, and also to see pictures of my grandparents from that era when my grandmother visited my grandfather at Harvard. And so it was really special then to be a student there and to walk around some of these places that had been special to them back in the day.
And what did you study at Harvard?
I studied history and economics. History, I think, unsurprisingly, but I was interested in econ as well. And my focus in history was 19th and 20th century American and European history.
And what'd you write your thesis about?
So I mentioned I loved the movie The Great Escape, and I wrote my 8th grade term paper on The Great Escape. And so I think this was kind of an idea that I couldn't let go. So when it came time to write my thesis, I ended up writing about British prisoner of war escape narratives in British culture, looking at the origin of this genre really as it emerged out of Victorian adventure fiction and moved into the memoir genre by Winston Churchill, who wrote an account of his own escape during the Boer War when he was taken prisoner and escaped from a Boer POW camp. And it was the story of his thrilling escape, which rocketed him to fame in Britain and launched his political career. So that was also my intro to Winston Churchill as a historian.
Yeah, I hope your research did not include watching the program Hogan's Heroes. I'm dating myself by even being aware of such a I've always thought how horrific that program was when you think about what went. I mean, I'm all for dramatizations, but to turn the Nazis into like these cuddly misfits was and it was like in the 60s. It was only 20 years after the war. Right. Anyway.
I have seen a few episodes of Hogan's Heroes, and I think the mentality, the cat and mouse game of the perfidious Albion backs to the wall victory, certainly a mentality that you needed to get you through some of those horrible times. And also I just love the stories from that period. Just you have regular people who are able to give more of themselves than they realized they could give, and just the ingenuity and creativity of especially POWs during that period I found fascinating, and it's something that I continue to be very interested in today.
And then you go off to Cambridge, the other Cambridge, as they say. And what were you a Marshall Scholar? Is that?
No, I was not a Marshall Scholar, but while I was there, I was at Christ College, and I was very fortunate to study with David Reynolds as my dissertation supervisor. As an undergrad, I got to work with Neil Ferguson, so to be able to have the two of them as my advisors was a great experience.
And what did you write about there?
So I was looking at the origins of modern counterintelligence practices as they emerged in Britain during the First World War, largely through a postal censorship initiative where the British government would read the mail coming from abroad and the outbound mail as well. And I didn't realize when I started doing the research for this that it was under Winston Churchill's leadership as Home Secretary that this program came into existence. And it also sparked some tension with the Americans before the US entered World War I, this idea that gentlemen don't read gentlemen's mail. And the discussion about a right to privacy had begun in the United States in a way that it had not yet in Britain. So it was this was taking place, I was working on this in 2013, 2014, and so it was timely with a lot of discussion around Edward Snowden. And so yeah, a great experience to work on that there.
And then you go to work at a Park Avenue firm, and that actually turns out to be highly significant. I know that the location of your first job after finishing at at Cambridge.
Yes, so I did what I thought was a smart thing to do, like many other people. I figured, I studied econ, maybe I should give finance a go. Easier to try that right out of school than later. But in the lobby of my office, where I was working as a financial analyst, was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which was named after Winston Churchill's country home. And they specialized in Winston Churchill first editions and other books by and about him. And
just pause there for a second. Yeah. This is an amazing New York institution that I've frankly only been aware of. I've never been there, but this is, an entire bookstore devoted to Winston Churchill. Yeah. What's the deal with that place? I mean, does the owner of the building have a particular interest in Churchill? What is this place?
I think it kind of accidentally became a Churchill bookstore. It was they decided on the name Chartwell without intending it to be a Churchill related bookstore per se, but a couple of people who worked in New York, I think even who worked in that building, they assumed that they specialized in Churchill works. And so you had somebody call down, this may have been in the 80s or 90s, called the store and said, hey, I would like the complete set of first editions of everything Winston Churchill ever wrote. And so the owner realized this was a great opportunity and that there was a real market for this. And so they began to collect significant works like that and trade in the Winston Churchill related genre. And they do sell other histories and books about New York, not just Winston Churchill, but Churchill is certainly the heart of their business.
So, okay, so you're working in this building, you go to this, this bookstore is in the building. Mm-hmm. And how does that lead to the book that we're discussing tonight?
Yes. So I was upstairs toiling away, working on my Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, and oftentimes you just couldn't take it anymore, needed a break. I'd go down to get a coffee, and inevitably I was drawn into the bookstore. And this was before the show The Crown came out, and so it was unusual to have a young female analyst come into the store wanting to look at books about Churchill. And I got to know the owner after so many visits there, and he suggested that I meet the International Churchill Society, which was a group of scholars and professionals and also members of the Churchill family who wanted to encourage the study of history and also encourage young people to go into public service and leadership using Winston Churchill's life as an example. And coincidentally, they were having a dinner around that time at the Waldorf featuring Madeleine Albright. And so the chance to hear Madeleine Albright speak and to talk to some of the International Churchill Society was a fantastic opportunity. And so I went over, offered to help, what can I do? And there I met some members of the family and the society. And around that time, they were opening Winston Churchill's middle daughter Sarah's papers to outside researchers for the first time. And shortly thereafter, they asked if I was interested in writing an article about her archives for their publication.
And did you? Is that what happened?
Yes. So I had the chance then to go back to Cambridge and use the archives that I had loved as a graduate student. And I began to look through her letters and papers and very quickly realized that there was so much more to say than could fit in an article. And at first I thought maybe I could write a book that's a biography of Sarah Churchill. She had a fascinating life. She was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the women's branch of the RAF during the war. And then after the war, she was an actress and dancer and even starred in a movie with Fred Astaire. So she had this very colorful life. But if people know anything about her, it's usually this experience as an actress. But I was really drawn to her war experience. And despite having studied the World War II and the Tehran and Yalta conferences in school many times, I had no idea that her father had chosen her to be his aide, first at the Tehran conference and then at Yalta. And not only had Sarah been at those conferences, but because Franklin Roosevelt and Ambassador Abel Harriman realized what an asset she was to her father at Tehran, they decided that they would also bring their daughters as their aides to Yalta. And as a student of the 20th century, 20th century history, I couldn't believe that I didn't know this. And it was kind of the niggle of an idea in the back of your head that I just couldn't step away from it. And I knew that there was a story there that somebody should tell, and I hope that that could be me.
And so just so we're clear, You start with Sarah Churchill, who was Winston Churchill's, her father's advisor at Yalta. You have Kathleen Harriman, who is the advisor to her father, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and from this celebrated, wealthy, rich railroad family from the United States, and Anna Roosevelt, who is FDR's daughter, and they are all the advisors to their fathers at the Yalta Conference, and that's what your book is about.
Yes.
Why don't you just start? And we're into what was the Yalta Conference? Why was it important? And just sort of set the stage.
The Yalta Conference takes place in February 1945, and at this point, the end of the war, especially in Europe, is finally in sight. This is the last time that Churchill, FDR, and Stalin meet together in person, and they're meeting to settle a few issues as the end of the war is drawing closer. So first is the issue of what to do about Germany in the post-war period. Germany has been the belligerent in 2 world wars. There's the question of, should Germany be allowed to remain one state? Should they break Germany into smaller states in hopes that it would limit any future aggression? So that's one of the main issues on the table. The second key issue is the future of Poland. So Britain had gone to war to protect Polish sovereignty, and it's very important to Winston Churchill and to Franklin Roosevelt to maintain these promises that were so important at the beginning of the war, to make sure that at the end, Poland is allowed to have a freely elected democratic government. But the Red Army from the Soviet Union has boots on the ground across Eastern Europe, including in Poland. And ever since the Tsarist era, Russia has been transfixed on this idea of having friendly neighbors. They've been invaded through the plains of Poland too many times, dating back to the Napoleonic era, as recently as the Nazis, as they are determined that the new government in Poland is going to be friendly to the interests in Moscow. Then sorry. Go ahead.
No, please continue. Yeah, continue.
Yes, and then the third issue, this is very important to Franklin Roosevelt, is trying to bring the Soviet Union into the war in the Pacific. The Soviet Union and Japan had a pact of neutrality throughout the war, and at this time, Roosevelt doesn't know if the atomic bomb will be a success. It's still in development, and so he's looking at a potential invasion of the home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. And so his priority is to save as many American lives as possible. And to do this, he thinks he should bring the Soviets into the war in exchange for some territorial concessions. And finally, and perhaps kind of the overarching goal of Franklin Roosevelt at this time is to succeed where Woodrow Wilson has failed, and to establish a peace organization of United Nations and bring the Soviet Union into the international community. And he hopes that, while internal peace is not possible, it's not realistic, but peace for 50 years is an attainable goal, especially in Europe, and this is what he wants to secure by establishing the United Nations.
It's an incredible turning point in modern world history, not just U.S. history. I mean, just so everybody realizes what date we're talking about, February 1945. The war in Europe is just about over. I mean, it is clear at this time that the Allies are going to win. Of course, everybody doesn't know, although we'll get to this, that Franklin Roosevelt is 2 months away, 2 months away from dying. The atomic bomb is going to be dropped in August. The entire war will end in August. And, this conference is widely considered, the turning point between World War II and the Cold War. Because, and as you write, so wonderfully about that the shifting alliances, whether the United States and the Soviet Union are allies or not is a very important question at that point. But before we get to that, one of the things that I thought was so interesting about your book was, I was always aware of the geopolitical aspects of Yalta, but I never thought about the place itself and what it was like. And you give a very vivid and wonderful description. What was Yalta? Where was Yalta? And why was this conference there?
Yes, so Yalta is situated on the coast of the Black Sea on the Crimean Peninsula. And many people today will know this area because of the hostilities that broke out between Russia and Ukraine in 2014 and subsequent issues there last year with the Kerch Strait. And so the Crimea is located in this crossroads between what has been warring empires dating back to the Crimean War in the 19th century, and then through the Second World War. So it really is this region that has just been soaked in the blood of violence for a very long period of time. And the reason that they decide to meet there is because Stalin is in a position at this point in the war where Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill need him a lot more than he needs them. He is very firmly in control of Eastern Europe, and there are certain issues that he is less willing to be flexible on. So Roosevelt and Churchill make the trek to the Soviet Union. Stalin is not willing to leave the safety of his security apparatus to travel any farther west. And he claims it's because his doctors say he shouldn't travel, he shouldn't fly. So Churchill and Roosevelt have to meet him in his territory. And in order to get there, they have to travel thousands of miles by air and by sea through what is still enemy-occupied territory with landmines, fly through area where there's still enemy anti-aircraft. And so it's an incredibly treacherous journey just to get to Yalta.
Yeah, let's just pause there for a minute, because that to me was just amazing in your book. Just how Churchill and Roosevelt have to get to Yalta, where the war in Europe is still raging. So it's not like you can just hop a flight. So how did Roosevelt and Churchill get to Yalta?
Yes, so Churchill flies first to Malta, where Churchill and Roosevelt are going to convene together and to work out some issues and present what they hope will be a united front once they arrive at Yalta and meet with Stalin. And there's an apocryphal joke that Stalin cables them and says, I said Yalta, not Malta. So their first stop is Malta. Churchill flies there, and very tragically on the way, one of the planes carrying members of his Foreign Office staff is lost over Italy. And so it's, the conference has not even begun, and already you can see how dangerous and treacherous it is. Franklin Roosevelt has to travel by ship across the Atlantic Ocean, where there are still enemy ships afloat. They have submarine sightings. It is by no means a safe trip. And if you think about the kinds of summits that take place today between the world leaders, you would never have a situation where these leaders are being asked to travel in such dangerous conditions, where somebody could very well die, and people do die on the way there. And so just the danger of getting there and the distance, it takes Roosevelt almost 2 weeks to get there. They can't sail all the way there because the Black Sea still has landmines everywhere. So they have to get to Malta and then fly from Malta to the Crimea and then drive 6 hours through war-torn landscape over mountains just to get to the Crimea, to Yalta.
It's a harrowing and vivid description. And so, okay, so that sets us up for the Yalta Conference. You've talked a little about Sarah Churchill. Who was Anna Roosevelt at this point? I mean, like, just give us a description, who was she? I mean, other than FDR's daughter, as we know.
Yes, so Anna Roosevelt is the oldest child and only daughter of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, and she is a mother of 3. She is married to a man named John Boettiger, this is her second husband, and they fell in love after her first marriage broke down. And he was somewhat controversially a Republican journalist at the time. They met on her father's campaign trail, and he worked for William Randolph Hearst, who was a key opponent and critic of FDR. But they put political differences aside, and Anna and John become the editors of a paper called Seattle Post-Intelligencer. So Anna has spent the first few years of the war living in Seattle, and then after her husband joins the army and ships out to the Mediterranean, she decides to move back home to the White House with her youngest son. Her older 2 children are in school, and so she moves into the White House, and she becomes a fixture in her father's world there, starts to take on many duties, secretary, speechwriter, and really kind of all-around gatekeeper, trying to help decide who really needs an audience with Roosevelt, who could meet with somebody else. So she becomes, in a sense, kind of filling a role that someone like Harry Hopkins, who had been one of Roosevelt's chief advisors and really his gatekeeper for the entirety of his administration. Harry Hopkins is very ill at the time, so Anna starts to step into the role that Hopkins had occupied for many years.
And you know, obviously it's tough to compete with Roosevelt and Churchill, but in many respects, for a book author, I think Averell Harriman may be the most interesting and colorful of the three. He certainly has the most colorful personal life. To talk about his daughter, and she's, I found, a very captivating figure in the book, and just talk a little. I mean, I think most people don't need much of an introduction to Roosevelt and Churchill, but tell us a little about Averell Harriman and then his daughter Kathleen.
Yes, so Averell Harriman is one of the most influential people of the 20th century that I think many people today are not familiar with. People, if they know him as a wise man of the Cold War. He was the governor of New York and a one-time Democratic presidential nominee. But before that, he, like his father before him, made their fortune in railroads. He was the chairman of Union Pacific, and he was involved in media. He was owned Newsweek. He was the one of the founders of Brown Brothers Harriman, a banking firm. And so he's involved in many different enterprises across the American economy. People also sometimes know him as the founder of Sun Valley, the first ski resort in America. After the 1932 Winter Olympics, Americans went crazy for skiing. And so he decided to build this glamorous ski resort to increase business on his Western Railroad lines to draw them out west. And so thanks to him, we have this robust skiing destination out west in America today, and also the first chairlift. But his daughter, Kathleen, is a very enthralling and energetic and adventurous woman who I think many people will kind of see as, you know, a modern girl in her times. She is an Olympic level skier. She's a crack shot, an expert equestrian. And she and her father were not especially close when she was a child. Her parents had divorced when she was a little girl, but after her mother died when she was a teenager, she and her father come together through their shared love of adventure and sport. And they really form a sort of partnership, more like colleagues than what we'd recognize between father and daughter. He's not an especially emotional person. He recognizes this about himself, but unlike many people of that era, he is very ahead of his times in wanting his daughters to be involved in his business affairs to the extent that they feel that they want to. And so he invites them to work with him at Sun Valley, which Kathleen does during her vacations in college, as they lay the groundwork for this partnership that they come to have during the war at Sun Valley. And it's after Averell becomes the Lend-Lease envoy in London before America enters the war. And he decides it would be a great opportunity for Kathleen to come with him, even though the Blitz is raging, and have this experience working as a war reporter in London. And I think this idea was perhaps inspired by his sister, Mary Harriman Rumsey, who was one of the two most important women, and probably the most important after Frances Perkins, in FDR's New Deal administration. And so he and his daughter have this really unique relationship where they are working side by side for many years, and he is very encouraging of her career and her opportunity to have this life experience and adventure before she gets married and has children.
Now, there's a fourth woman in this book who is not one of the three daughters, but is certainly a...
I think it went to mute for a second. I'm sorry, the sound cut out.
There's some question about whether, you know, like presidential speeches might have been deductible beforehand, but they might not.
I hear something.
It seems like it's on a bit of a delay.
Oh, speeches. Those were deductible, though. By who? By the company. Or Goldman Sachs paid her.
It seems like it's pulling an audio from somebody else's audio.
It seemed like that.
Well, I'm just saying that.
Not sure how that could be possible. Jeffrey, do you mind exiting and coming back in?
You know, and people said,
Right.
that they are absolutely deductible, but there's a sort of a reasonable and customary or something.
Ordinary method.
Yeah, there's a level. You can, it is just grossly out of line. But the IRS is going to be very reluctant to say, let's too expensive for a hotel to spend on linens. And I think about how
I don't know where the extra audio is coming from, but hopefully it'll be fixed in a second.
Yeah, that's odd. You can feel free to keep talking if you want to while you're waiting.
Yes, so, oh, looks like he's back.
No, but the tiger guns are not Mar-a-Lago.
Still not working. Well, I can see something else while we kind of figure out the audio for that, if that works. Perhaps, I don't know if there's another sound feed coming into a computer, like a video running in the background or something that might be confusing the audio.
no, the entity with which that holds the apprentice.
Okay, I'll work on this with Jeffrey if you want to tell a little bit more about your process and working.
Certain things in your own personal life that are ordinary.
So one of the best parts of the experience of working on this was I had the opportunity to look at sources that many people had not had a chance to see before. And one of those was the chance to see Sarah Churchill's papers, which had not been available to researchers prior to this. And I was very fortunate to be one of the first people to go through that comprehensively. And also, it was very kind of the Churchill family to allow me to also access the papers of Mary Churchill, Sarah's sister, who some of you may be familiar with from Eric Larson's book, The Splendid and the Vile. And her papers were also not available at the time. So I got to have the family very kindly gave me permission to see the correspondence between Sarah and Mary, which was fantastic. Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I seem to be back, and I hope you did you answer about Pamela while we were?
No, I did not. I did not answer the panel. I wanted to make sure that
that's
you
where
could
the
hear
story
Pamela.
gets all juicy and full of sex and all that, and that's good, right? So that's what we want to sell some books here. All right. So talk about Pamela.
Yes, so Pamela Churchill is a notorious figure of the 20th century. Some people love her, some people hate her. She was certainly influential. During World War II, she is married to Winston Churchill's son, Randolph, and she and Kathleen Harriman become best friends when Kathleen moves to London.
And now
Pamela,
they're like peers. I mean, they're both young.
Yes, Pamela is 2 years younger than Kathleen. And the Churchills and the Harrimans are very good friends at this time. So close friends that they are actually celebrating Kathleen's 24th birthday on December 7th, 1941, when they hear the news about Pearl Harbor. So this is how close these two families are. And shortly thereafter, it turns out that the families are even closer than at first glance. Averil Harriman and Pamela Churchill develop a relationship, enter into an affair, and Kathleen agrees to cover up for the affair because in a sense it guarantees that even if things in London get very dangerous, she is less likely to be sent home because she's indispensable in this way to maintain appearances of their relationship. That, you know, it's just, oh no, just Kathleen and Pamela are friends. Meanwhile, this is also happening in the background. And Sarah Churchill was also aware of this, and to keep the peace in her family, she also agreed to keep the secret. But Pamela, as some people may know, also had relationships with a number of other gentlemen at this time, including broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, and two other senior military individuals, one British and one American, who were also at the Yalta Conference. And so a number of the letters that we have from this period at Yalta are from people who were writing to Pamela to give her an account of what they're seeing. And she's one of these people in history who just had this hold over anyone she came across. She'd stare into your eyes and make you feel like the most important person in the room. And so she is a character who is very present, even though she's not physically at Yalta.
Right. I mean, I mean, she is perhaps the most famous femme fatale of the mid 20th century. And I don't want to get too far off into the Pamela Harriman story. They have this big affair. They go their separate ways. Many years later, they reunite in Washington when he's quite old and she's middle-aged. They marry, then they rekindle their affair, marry, and she becomes this doyenne of Washington society. And just forgive me, one of my favorite, Bill Clinton names her ambassador to France. And while she is ambassador to France, she dies of a heart attack while swimming at the hotel in the Ritz Hotel pool, which if you're going to die, it strikes me as a pretty good way to die.
Yes.
Anyway, so that's enough about Pamela.
Yes.
So the three women come to Yalta. What do they do there? I mean, this is sort of this is the meat of the book, but what are their roles?
Yes, so they occupy a very interesting role where they're in this kind of quasi-official position where they're not necessarily representatives of their government, they are not diplomats outright, but because they are their father's daughters, they can speak with the authority of their fathers and deliver subtle nuances and messages that you may not want to have in the conference room, that are not necessarily representing the official position of that country's government, but they're important messages to deliver nonetheless. And so they're kind of in this gray area where they can operate, gather information, report back to their fathers, share certain information with others. And so this is kind of a unique position that all three of them are in. But they do all, because of their prior experiences, have unique skills that make each of them important to their father at this conference in very different ways.
How so?
So for example, Kathleen Harriman, she spoke Russian. When her father becomes the ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943, she moves with him. She's determined to stay with him throughout the whole war. And so she decides that she will learn Russian for both of them because he won't have time. And she does achieve a level of proficiency where she's able to interpret for him in social engagements, not necessarily kind of the technical elements of interpreting in government negotiations, but she is very capable. And so she is able to work with the Soviet team that is preparing this palace that has been absolutely ransacked by the Nazis. The Soviets have a Herculean job of turning this palace that has been stripped of everything, literally down to the doorknobs, and working with the Soviet teams to make sure that everything is just right. So kind of operating as what we would recognize today as a protocol officer at the State Department. Sarah Churchill, as I mentioned, was in the women's branch of the RAF, and because of her role as an aerial and reconnaissance intelligence analyst, she is very familiar with specific details of some of the largest Allied operations of World War II. And sometimes she even knows these details even better than her father, much to his amusement, and it was a great source of pride for him as well. Sarah is also an actress, and so she has these great skills both as a strategist and one who has a very canny grasp of politics, but also because she has this actress's deportment and demeanor, she is a fantastic diplomat and is able to work through some very uncomfortable situations that she encounters at the conference. And Anna Roosevelt, having been an editor, she has a keen grasp for language and the communications that come out of Yalta that her father delivers to the nations at the end. She helps to draft this and edit this. But at the conference, she's also in a really important position that nobody knows at the time that she's occupying. Her father is very sick and he's dying of congestive heart failure, but no one other than Anna and the doctor know just how sick he is at the time. And so she is trying to run interference and minimize the amount of pressure that he has to deal with on a daily basis.
Let's pause there for a moment, because it's sort of a topical issue, and we can get to that. But what kind of shape was FDR in? I'm a little sensitive on this subject. When he wasn't that old. I mean, he was in his mid-60s. I mean, he was not an old man, but there are these famous photographs, some of them in your book, of FDR at Yalta, and he looks horrendous. I mean, he just looks terrible. What is his physical state? And of course, getting there, as you pointed out earlier, would have been stressful for anyone, but particularly for him, given what was his physical condition at this point?
Yes, so when Anna moved into the White House in 1944, she realized something was not right about her father. He just was not as sharp with the details. He'd kind of stare off into space with his mouth hanging open. And so something wasn't right. And so she insisted that he have a comprehensive medical examination. So he goes to the hospital where he's examined by a cardiologist who determines that he in fact has congestive heart failure. And there is no cure for this. All that can be done is mitigating these symptoms and changing his diet, his daily routine to minimize pressure on him, make him as healthy as possible.
To minimize pressure on him.
Yes.
He is running World War II,
yes.
where the fate of the world is on the line. So the idea that you could somehow minimize pressure is it's almost endearing in a way, right. But the idea that you could somehow do that, shows a certain naivete perhaps on the part of the doctors, although you can't blame them for trying.
Right. I mean, they can offer suggestions. Whether Roosevelt is willing to or able to follow them is another matter. But the other problem complicating this is that FDR doesn't want to know what's wrong with him. He never asks the doctor anything about his assessment of his health, even though he has all of a sudden these drastic changes to his diet, people encouraging him to work less, his daughter really trying to sort out who has to meet with him, who has an audience, who can meet with someone else. She even goes so far as to sometimes take papers out of his inbox at night and distribute them to other people who can handle them. So she's trying to do anything she can to relieve stress on him, which is really a very tall order to say the least. But he doesn't want to know what's wrong with him, and maybe that's, he just doesn't want the distraction. He is running the war, running the country, and to know that you're dying is, going to interfere with that in numerous ways. And also maybe there's an element of plausible deniability, and he doesn't want to know what's wrong with him. He doesn't want to have his chance of running for a fourth term jeopardized, and so he doesn't ask. Eleanor Roosevelt similarly is somewhat oblivious to it, some willful blindness. She just doesn't want to see and doesn't want to admit that her husband is very sick. And so sadly, it falls on Anna to carry this burden largely alone. And so when she goes with him to Yalta, she's desperate to keep the secret of his ill health as close to her as possible. But rumors have started to leak out about how sick he is, and the Soviets have their suspicions.
And the good news is, now we have a situation where our president's health it's an open book, and we know exactly what's going on with our. I'm kidding. No, we have no idea what's going on. But I mean, actually, Roosevelt is someone who was frequently cited as an example, and Woodrow Wilson and John F. Kennedy. Presidents historically have been secretive, if not deceptive, about their medical condition. So what's going on now, not to defend it, there is precedent for it. Let's talk about the conference itself. How long does the conference go? How many days?
So the conference takes place over the course of 8 days. And there are, every day there's a meeting among the big three, where they're meeting in the ballroom of Levadia Palace, where the Tsar's teenage daughter once had, her grand coming out party. You can imagine there's these echoes of a time gone by of the Romanov era, but now it's just this stark conference room with one table and chairs and no adornments. This is where they're meeting every day. And outside of this, the plenary session among the three leaders and their chief advisors, there are also meetings of the foreign ministers, of the military chiefs of staff. There are very important logistical issues to work out among the three of them, as there's, they're racing to liberate Berlin so they don't accidentally shell each other on the way. And so it's not just about setting up the post-war period, but really about how to most efficiently end the war.
I don't want to give away the whole book, but Yalta is certainly among conservatives. It was perceived and still regarded by many conservatives as Roosevelt sort of selling out, that Roosevelt allowed Stalin free rein to take over Poland, to wind up dividing Germany. Where do you stand in that, in the debate about sort of who won the negotiation?
Right. Well, I think we look at this period and you look at what came after, and there are certain decisions that were made at Yalta and certain concessions that were made to Stalin, especially in Poland, where if Roosevelt and Churchill had a more united front in their negotiations with him, perhaps they would have been able to achieve a better outcome. Around this time, George Kennan is a very young strategist and expert in Russia. He's the #2 at the embassy in Moscow with Abel Harriman. And so you can see some of the kind of the early Cold War strategy emerging at this time. But whether or not Churchill and Roosevelt had they conferenced more, FDR is very unwilling to meet with Churchill before the conference because Churchill exhausts him and he's trying to save his strength as much as possible. Anna Roosevelt is also trying to keep Churchill away from her father as much as possible, which is detrimental, I think, to the outcome. And maybe if they had been stronger, Stalin would have respected the strength meeting strength and been willing to make some more concessions. However, it's very tempting to ask these questions, but you end up in this counterfactual spiral of what ifs. And really, for things to have been different, I think changes would have had to have been made as early as 1943, 44, because at this time the Soviets have boots on the ground across Eastern Europe. The Red Army is firmly in control, and so to have make any difference there, you would have had to have opened the Western Front much earlier, 6 months to a year earlier, which would have meant arming in the United States and Britain much earlier, and having had wartime preparedness. So all these decisions have a trickle-down effect. And also, FDR is dying at the time and he's doing his best, and the fact that he's even there is incredible. And so maybe if he had been at his best, he could have had a stronger position and could have negotiated more firmly with Stalin. But at the end of the day, the reality was, this was, who was in control in some of these contentious areas that very tragically, continued to suffer for 50 years after the war because of the outcome at Yalta. So I think it's,
you do a great job of sort of raising the historiological debates over should they have given up Poland? I mean, it's like the Soviet troops are there. I don't know what they were supposed to do to force the Soviet troops out. I mean, but that's one of the joys of this book is that it is so many different things. It is a World War II book. It is a Cold War book, but it's really about these three women. And in the remaining time, I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened to the three of them afterwards, because I think that's extremely interesting and sort of poignant.
yes. I think these three women, they recognized that Yalta was a unique opportunity for them to be important to their fathers in a way that they had always wanted to be since the time they were little girls. And the war offered women, including these three women, incredible opportunities to utilize the gifts and talents that they had in ways that they didn't before and they didn't after. And there is a palpable sense, as these three women are at Yalta, that the window of opportunity is open now, but it soon will be closing. And for them to have this precious moment with their fathers, it is, in a sense, enough. And so the three women, they go forward. Their lives are very different after the war than they had been during the war, each trying to return to their normal lives. Sarah as an actress, Anna attempting to return as an editor and owner of a newspaper, and Kathleen works for a short period of time back for Newsweek once again as a journalist before she gets married. But the three women are also touched by a lot of the scars of this time, like everybody else who endured through the war, and they suffer some similar tragedies. What we would now see as mental health issues that everybody had after the war, especially those who had fought on their front lines. The husbands of these three women are no different. And so they go through a number of similar struggles that are ones that are really shared by so many people in the post-war period. And while they don't remain close friends after the fact, their lives are always intertwined. And through some of these shared life experiences in the aftermath, they do occasionally come together and sympathize with each other, kind of knowing what they're going through, but the fact that it's also displayed for all the world to see because of who they are.
Well, I guess I had a different reaction a little to the end of the book, which was, I mean, these are obviously three intelligent, vibrant personalities, people with a lot of potential. And, Sarah Churchill is kind of an actress, but the other two, I mean, it's like not much happens to them and not much, and they don't really get a chance to apply their talents because, I mean, I would submit, as the lawyers say, because of the way women are, the place of women in society after, we're 1945. I mean, isn't that part of the story?
It absolutely is part of the story, and it's I hesitate to say kind of too much about that, because I think living through that period, they would not have said, "Gosh, I wish I could do this or do that," because they wouldn't have had that opportunity. They wouldn't have not had that as an option. I really believe that Sarah Churchill, had she been alive, had she been born 10 years later, she could have been her father's successor in politics. She had a very astute political mind. She was a brilliant writer. You can see this in just looking at a handful of her letters. And so I think that had she been born, 10 years later, like Margaret Thatcher, perhaps she could have been a force in British politics in her own right. And that's a real loss for the world that she doesn't have that opportunity. Anna Roosevelt had been kind of trying to fight against the mores of society since the time she was a young woman. She resisted being a debutante, and even though her parents were very liberal-minded, they still wanted her to be part of that world. And so she just never has the opportunities to explore what she might have been able to do. She does have this chance, as an editor, but it's not something that she is able to do to the extent that a woman might be able to do today. And Kathleen Harriman's also a really unique person because she is a war reporter. She is a journalist. But after the war, she does get married and have children, and she was a wonderful mother. And hearing the stories of her sons talking about her mother and their memories of her, this is something that was, also one of the greatest joys of her life. And she had an incredibly close relationship with her children. And what's really interesting is, like so many members of her generation, she was very humble and didn't talk about her experience during the war. They really didn't know the details of her life then. And the only kind of hints here and there would be when she'd say goodnight to them, and sometimes she would wish them goodnight in Russian. And so it's really, you can see, for certain women like Sarah Churchill, that she would have really flourished had she had more opportunities. And Kathleen Harriman, I think she certainly would have, but she also was very content in her life afterwards. And I think she kind of saw her life, in chapters, and she had one thrilling, exciting adventure, and the post-war was a new adventure.
In our we have several questions from the audience, sort of about your archival experience. Obviously, you were very focused on this experience in their lives in Yalta. What else in the archive struck you as especially interesting, other than Yalta?
Is the question kind of things related to Yalta or specific?
No, I'm just like anything. I mean,
So one of the parts of the story that I find really interesting is you see certain figures in history and characters who become kind of stars in their own right, emerging in their careers at this time. You see a very young George Kennan, a very young Chip Bolin, who become the wise men of the Cold War. But you also have characters like Alger Hiss, who was a notorious double agent, one of the most controversial people in the Cold War period, and he is at Yalta as one of the very few members of the State Department who's there. Roosevelt does not like the State Department. He doesn't really trust the State Department. He thinks that he has this close personal relationship with Stalin, and that the State Department is just going to get in the way. But he does take Alger Hiss, who is a young man, and he's there to assist Edward Stettinius, who's been the Secretary of State for only 2 months. But he is also working as a double agent for the Soviets at this time. And so his life and kind of some of these characters who are in the story, they're not the main figures, but I found them so fascinating, and to tie them into what's happening, outside of the conference room. It's just, there's so many compelling details and so many lives that transect with Yalta. That was, those were some of the great moments as I'm doing archival research that I would have loved to spend hours and days and months exploring further.
All right, in the very few minutes we have left, let's talk about you. You're at Harvard Law School, which is a great thing to be. But why are you at Harvard Law School?
Yeah.
You're like this successful book author now. And,
Yeah, so in addition to being a writer and historian, I'm also a second-year student at Harvard Law School. I had applied to law school while I was working in finance, and it was around the same time that I was introduced to Sarah's archive. And so I decided to apply to law school. I didn't know what was going to happen with the seed of an idea that I had. And very fortunately, I was admitted to Harvard Law School, and they kindly allowed me to defer for 2 years before I started. And so I was finished the book while also being a first-year law student, which is grueling. I don't recommend it to anyone. Save yourself the aggravation, but I learned a lot. And so right now I'm actually taking the semester off to focus on the book at this time, but I do plan to work on another book and kind of see the two going hand in hand. And I think history and the law is one of those fields where you can marry the two. And I want to keep writing history and to continue telling these hidden stories, but also to use the law to help us understand how to employ that history to move forward better in the future.
Can you tell us what other book that I'm interested, Sarah, some of our audience is interested, what else would you like to write about? Do you have another book in mind?
I do have a subject for another book in mind. I've begun some of the secondary source research for this. I hesitate to say too much about it because the paradox of COVID is that we have a lot of time that we didn't have before, not being able to travel, but COVID also means I can't travel to archives. A lot of the archives I would need to do primary source research are not open. And so until I can get into the archive and see what's there and whether or not my early impressions will be borne out, as I said, I started this book thinking it was going to be a biography about Sarah Churchill, and it changed dramatically because of being guided by the sources that I found. And so I want to make sure that I do my job as a historian to really mine those primary sources before saying exactly.
And there is I don't want to tell tales out of school, there is the possibility of some sort of adaptation of this book, right? I mean, isn't that for miniseries or whatever? Because it's quite cinematic. I mean,
I'm glad you think so. Yes, Amy Pascal optioned this. She's the producer of Little Women, The Post, so very excited about that. And hope to see the Daughters of Yalta live on in other iterations in different ways of storytelling.
Well, I'm for that. Anyway, Catherine, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for writing this wonderful book. I really encourage everyone to go buy it, and you should buy it at Harvard Bookstore, not anywhere else. I thank you all for listening, and wish you all well. We have a final word from our host.
Yes, thank you both once again so much for such an interesting conversation. I personally found the conversation fascinating, and I'm excited to read the book. So thank you to all the audience out there for spending your evening with us. Like I said before, you can learn more about this book and purchase The Daughters of Yalta at the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I just want to say have a good night, keep reading, and please be well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.